There's a particular kind of quiet confidence that comes with age, and most people mistake it for surrender. They see an old man moving slowly through the world and they assume the world has worn him down. They never consider that maybe, just maybe, he's the one who wore the world down first. My name is Lawrence Beaumont. I'm 69 years old. I live in a 2-story brick house on a narrow street in Hamilton, Ontario. The kind of neighborhood where the maple trees have grown tall enough to meet each other over the road and make a canopy in the summer that turns gold and red every October like the whole street is showing off. I've lived in this house for 34 years. I bought it for $147,000 when Hamilton was still a steelworkers' city, and nobody from Toronto was calling it up and coming. I drive a 2006 Dodge Grand Caravan, burgundy, or something close to burgundy under the right light. The sliding door on the passenger side has to be lifted slightly before you close it, or it won't latch right. The back bumper has a dent from a parking lot in Ancaster that I haven't fixed because, honestly, it hasn't affected anything, and I've never been the kind of man who fixes things just for appearances. My son Owen, he's been telling me to sell that van for 3 years. I tell him it has 200,000 kilometers on it and still runs clean. So what exactly is the argument for getting rid of it? I wear plain clothes. Work pants, flannel shirts in the winter, cotton button-downs in the summer. Good boots. I've worn Red Wings since 1989, and I've had the same pair resoled twice. My neighbor Stuart, who retired from the fire station on Barton Street 2 years ago, told me last spring while we were both clearing our driveways after a March storm that I was the least complicated man he'd ever met. I told him I'd take that as a compliment. He laughed and said he meant it as one. Here is what Stuart doesn't know. What the folks at my parish don't know. What the young woman at the bank on King Street West didn't know last November, when she walked me through the new online account interface with the slow, patient voice you use with someone's grandfather, who might struggle with the touchscreen. 31 years ago, I started a company called Bohm Cold Store Solutions in a leased unit behind a Mississauga industrial park. Refrigerated warehousing and cold chain logistics. We handled perishable freight, grocery chains, pharmaceutical distributors, food manufacturers. Contracts nobody thought were glamorous but that every single supply chain in the country quietly depends on. I built it without investors, without venture capital, without a single feature in a business magazine. I built it the way my father built the deck behind his house in Brantford. One board at a time, level checked after every piece. Today, Beaumont Cold Store operates 19 facilities across 6 provinces. Revenue north of $340 million annually. None of it under my name in any database a casual search would turn up. I restructured through a holding company, still my decisions. But nothing that would connect Lawrence Beaumont on a Google search to anything other than an address in Hamilton, and a LinkedIn profile I haven't updated since 2011. I built it that way on purpose. In Canada, I've noticed there are 2 kinds of wealth. The kind that announces itself, the cottage in Muskoka posted on Instagram, the Porsche in the driveway, the name on a hospital wing. And the kind that just quietly keeps working. I chose the second kind before the first kind had a social media platform to perform on. Now let me tell you about my son. Owen Beaumont is 36 years old and he is, and I say this as a man who has loved him every day of his life and always will. He is someone I have spent the last 4 years trying very hard to still understand. Owen is smart. He has a good instinct for people when he chooses to use it. He has his mother's sense of humor, which is to say he's genuinely funny when he's not trying to be impressive. His mother Diane passed 6 years ago. Ovarian cancer. She was 61 years old and she faced it with more dignity than most people manage in their entire lives. I still have her reading glasses on the windowsill in the kitchen. I know that sounds like a small thing. It isn't. Owen married a woman named Sylvia Carmichael-Holts 3 years ago. And I want to be fair here because I've learned over many decades that a father's first instincts about the person his child loves can say more about the father than the person. So I'll describe Sylvia Carmichael-Holts as charitably as I can. Sylvia Carmichael-Holts is 33 years old, very polished, very precise in the way that people are when precision has become their primary form of communication. She works in marketing for a commercial real estate firm in Mississauga, and she is very good at it, which means she is very good at presenting surfaces. She's not unkind. She's the opposite of unkind. She's extravagantly kind in the performative way, the kind where the warmth arrives first and you notice the calculation underneath it about 15 minutes later, once you've already accepted the warmth. She calls me Lawrence with a particular emphasis that manages to sound both respectful and slightly pitying at the same time, the way a person speaks to someone they've already quietly filed under not a concern. Within the first dinner at Owen and Sylvia's place in Oakville, Sylvia mentioned the neighborhood 3 times, the school district twice, and something called the Carmichael legacy once, which turned out to be a reference to her grandfather, who had been a provincial cabinet minister in the 1970s. Good for him. I said so. She looked mildly disappointed that I didn't know which cabinet minister. Owen, when Sylvia's name came up in conversation before they were married, would get a particular look. A tightening around the eyes, not unhappy, more like a man concentrating very hard on something that requires balance. I filed that away. I file things away. It's a habit from 40 years in business. Everything gets filed, nothing gets discarded. 18 months after the wedding, Owen was offered the position of Regional Director of Eastern Operations at a cold chain logistics firm called Northline Distribution, a mid-sized company servicing grocery and pharmaceutical clients across Ontario and Quebec. 1,200 employees, a serious operation. Now here is the part that Sylvia Carmichael-Holt would, if she ever came to understand it, find deeply uncomfortable. Northline Distribution is a subsidiary of Beaumont Cold Store Solutions. It has been since 2017, when I acquired it quietly through a numbered company. The acquisition didn't make the trades because I structured it to not make the trades. Northline kept its name, its management, its brand. That was intentional. I've always believed that a company you've acquired runs better when it still feels like its own thing. Owen got the Northline job through a recruiting firm in Toronto, 4 rounds of interviews. A thorough process. The board, Northline's board, which reported to my people, though nobody at Northline knew who my people ultimately reported to, reviewed 3 finalists. Owen was genuinely the strongest candidate. I want to be clear about that. He had the experience. He had the track record. He earned the offer. What he did not know, what Sylvia did not know, was that I had been given the interview recordings as a courtesy operations VP, that I had reviewed the finalists' assessments, and that I had quietly approved Owen's compensation package, his benefit structure, and his signing bonus before the offer was made. Then I went home. I made myself a pot of tea. I watched a hockey game. The Leafs lost, which they do with a kind of majestic regularity that is almost comforting. Owen texted me that evening, "Big news, Dad, got the director role, really good package, hard work pays off." I wrote back, "Very proud of you, son." Then I turned off the lamp and went to bed. I genuinely wanted Owen to do well. I want you to understand that. I gave him every opportunity, not because I planned to use it later, but because I love my son and I wanted to watch him succeed on his own terms. What shifted things was not what happened at Northline. What shifted things was what I saw happen to him away from work. It started small. These things always do. There was a Sunday dinner at their place in Oakville. A perfectly nice house, newly renovated kitchen. The kind of light fixtures that get picked to suggest taste rather than provide light. Some of Owen's colleagues from Northline were there, of Sylvia's friends from the marketing world. At one point, one of Sylvia's friends asked me how I was keeping myself busy in retirement. Before I could answer, Sylvia laughed and said, "Oh, Lawrence worked in logistics like ages ago. He's very low-key about it." She touched my arm as she said it warmly, the performance of warmth, and then the conversation moved on. Worked in logistics like ages ago. I smiled. I had some more wine. I talked to the man beside me about the Raptors. I filed it away. Then there was the night last October when I stopped by Owen and Sylvia's unannounced. Something I rarely do. But I had been driving back from a board meeting in Burlington and I was close. And I had leftover soup in a container from Sunday, that Diane's recipe. I stood at their front door for a moment after ringing the bell and heard voices carrying through from the kitchen. Owen and Sylvia in conversation, not arguing, just talking. Sylvia said, "I just think for the dinner, the table at Canoe would be so much more appropriate. My parents have a certain, your dad is sweet, but he's going to show up in that van, and Dad's going to be asking him about golf and tennis, and it's just going to be awkward." Owen said something quietly that I couldn't quite catch. Sylvia again, "I'm not saying anything bad about him. He's lovely. He's just, he's not really that kind of dinner, is he? Not really that kind of dinner." I stood on their porch for a long moment, then I knocked. Sylvia answered with a warm smile, entirely intact, no trace of the conversation, and said, "Lawrence, what a surprise! Come in, come in." She said it with the particular brightness of a woman very good at switching registers quickly. I stayed for 20 minutes. The soup was appreciated. I drove home on the 403. For the next 3 months I went about my life. I went to my church on Sunday mornings. I had coffee with Stuart on Wednesdays. I drove to the grocery store on the Queenston Road. I raked my leaves when they needed raking, which in Hamilton in November is essentially a part-time job. And I thought about what kind of man I was going to be about what I'd heard. I decided, as I have decided in most complicated situations in my life, to wait. Then came the phone call that changed the calculation entirely. It was a Thursday evening in February. Owen called, which was normal enough, but something in the way he started the conversation told me this wasn't a regular call. He warmed up to it, asked about the house, asked about Stuart, asked whether I'd heard the city was finally repaving the street, and then he said, "Dad, Sylvia and I want to have you for dinner. Her parents are in from Oakville, the Carmichael-Holts. Everyone wants to meet you properly." I said, of course, I'd be happy to. Then 2 days later Sylvia called me directly. She was cheerful, she was warm, she was very specific. She said, "Lawrence, we're so excited to have everyone together. I just want to mention the Carmichael-Holts are pretty traditional. Formal dinner, that kind of thing. You know how it is. So maybe dress up a little, just to make it feel special." A pause. Then, just a thought. No pressure at all. I thanked her for the heads up. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen for a moment looking at the window above the sink, where the maple in the backyard was bare and the February sky was the color of old concrete. I thought about Diane. I thought about what she used to say, that the clearest view you ever get of a person is when they think the power is entirely theirs. I thought about my father, who was a machinist at the Stelco plant in Hamilton for 31 years and wore his good suit exactly twice a year. Christmas Eve in the Grey Cup, if the Ticats made it. He was the most dignified man I've ever known. I walked into my bedroom. I opened my closet. I passed the charcoal wool suit I wore to close a $47 million deal in Calgary in 2019. I passed the navy blazer. I pulled out my cleanest flannel shirt, dark gray, no fraying, washed and pressed. My good dark corduroys and my red wings. I laid them on the bed for Saturday. Then I walked out to the driveway and stood beside the Caravan in the February air, exhaling little clouds. I patted the roof once, the way you do. I said nothing out loud because I'm not quite that far gone. But I thought, we've got a dinner to go to and the dress code is exactly what we are. Because here's what Sylvia Carmichael-Holt did not understand. Here's what her parents, Roger and Marguerite Carmichael-Holt, did not understand. I wasn't showing up in a flannel shirt and the burgundy van because I had nothing better. I was showing up that way because I wanted to sit at that table and see, clearly without any performance from my side muddying the view, exactly who those people were when they believed nothing important was at stake. I'd been doing this for 40 years. I was very good at it. Saturday arrived quietly, the way February Saturdays in Ontario do. Gray sky, cold that's polite rather than cruel, the city moving slower than a weekday. I was up at 5:30, which I have been every morning since 1987. Coffee in the percolator that was Diane's mother's. I sat at the kitchen table and looked out at the maple and thought about nothing in particular, which is something I've gotten better at as I've gotten older. The active mind, I've learned, is sometimes the enemy of a good decision. I dressed slowly. The flannel shirt, the corduroys, the red wings. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror and I thought, yes, this is right. The drive to Oakville took about 40 minutes on the QEW. Owen and Sylvia's neighborhood was the kind where the houses were all slightly different but the landscaping was all slightly the same. The coordinated restraint of people who wanted to signal taste without anyone suspecting they'd tried. I pulled the Caravan into their driveway just after 6. Owen opened the door before I knocked. He looked relieved to see me, which struck me as an odd thing to feel when your father arrives for dinner, but I didn't say anything. He hugged me with the kind of grip that means something, and I held it an extra second. The Carmichael-Holts were already there. Roger Carmichael-Holt was 72, silver-haired, broad in the shoulders the way men are who played rugby in university and still mention it. He was dressed in what I'd call deliberate casualness, a blazer over an open-collar shirt, slacks that had been pressed. His handshake was the kind that establishes something before any word has been spoken. He said, "Lawrence, great to finally meet you. Owen's told us a lot." He had a voice calibrated to carry rooms. Marguerite Carmichael-Holt was elegant, precisely put together, the kind of woman who never has a hair out of place because a hair out of place would represent a personal failure of planning. She took my hand in both of hers and said, "We have been just dying to meet Sylvia's father-in-law." Then she glanced, once, quickly at my flannel shirt. Not long enough to be rude, long enough for me to see it. We moved into the dining room. Sylvia had set a beautiful table, the real china, the good napkins, candles that probably cost more than my grandmother's weekly grocery bill. Everything was meant to establish something. I sat down, unfolded my napkin, and made the decision to become exactly what they expected. The quiet retired father-in-law from Hamilton, a little plain, decent enough fellow, not really that kind of dinner. Roger led the conversation the way men who have always led conversations lead them, confidently, from the front, with the absolute assumption that the room wants to hear what he has to say. He talked about a renovation at their Muskoka cottage. He talked about the stock market, specifically in the way that people talk about the stock market when they want you to know they have one. He talked about Owen's tremendous potential at Northline, which was generous, and which I appreciated, And then he turned to me with the warm, slightly careful expression of a man about to ask a polite question he doesn't particularly need the answer to. "So, Lawrence," he said, "retired life treating you well?" I said it was, thank you. "What was your field, before you retired?" "Logistics," I said. He nodded the way people nod when they've received exactly the amount of information they expected, and it has confirmed what they already thought. Right. Warehousing type of thing?" "Something like that," I said pleasantly, and he moved on. Marguerite, somewhere between the salad and the main course, turned to Owen with a smile that had a particular architecture. She said, "You know, Owen, Sylvia's grandfather always said that a man's real measure is in how he provides for his family. You've taken on so much responsibility at Northline. It's really something." Then she looked across the table at me, warm, inclusive, the performance of inclusion. "You must be so proud of everything he's built." I said I was. I picked up my water glass. I took a long, slow sip, and I waited. Because I knew, with the certainty of a man who has been patient for 30 years, that the folder was coming. Roger waited until Sylvia was bringing out dessert. He reached beside his chair. He placed a document folder on the table. Dark blue, legal-looking, the kind of thing that says someone's lawyer has been involved. He smoothed the cover once with his palm. Then he slid it across the table toward me. "Lawrence," he said, "we'd like to have a family conversation." I looked at the folder. I did not reach for it. Owen was very still. Sylvia was standing at the doorway from the kitchen with a serving dish in her hands, and she had set her expression to something between encouraging and neutral. Owen's thumb was pressing into the back of his other hand, which was something he'd done since he was 8 years old when he didn't want to show he was nervous. Roger said, "Owen has a real vision, an independent venture. He wants to build something of his own, and frankly, we think he has everything it takes." He paused for effect. "What this requires is capital, initial capital. And what we're proposing, it's very clean, completely above board, fully documented, is using a portion of your estate as collateral. Your future bequest to Owen, essentially deployed a little earlier, as security for a private financing arrangement. Quite standard, actually." He leaned back. He had the relaxed posture of a man who considered this conversation essentially already complete. I picked up the folder. I opened it. I read every page. The candles burned quietly. Roger poured himself a little more wine. Marguerite smoothed her napkin. Sylvia set the dessert dishes out with great care and deliberation. Owen looked at the table. I finished reading. I closed the folder. I set it back precisely where Roger had placed it. I said, "I appreciate you putting this together. I'd like to take some time to look it over carefully." Roger exhaled. The tension at the table shifted like a barometric pressure change. Owen's shoulders dropped. Sylvia smiled from the kitchen doorway, and it was the most genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. They thought the difficult part was over. I had dessert. I talked to Roger about the tickets. He wasn't a fan, but he was polite about it. I told Marguerite the lemon tart was exceptional and meant it. I shook Roger's hand at the door, firmly, holding his eyes 1 second longer than necessary. He didn't know what that second meant. Someday he would. I drove home on the QEW. The city lights of Hamilton came up on the escarpment as I took the exit, and the old houses at the top of the mountain were dark and small and patient-looking. I said nothing for 11 days. I went to church on Sunday. I had coffee with Stuart. I drove to the grocery store. I fixed a leaking tap in the upstairs bathroom that I'd been meaning to fix since November. On the 4th day, Owen texted, "Hey Dad, hope you've had a chance to look at the proposal. Let me know when you want to talk." I waited a few hours. I wrote back, "Still looking it over. These things take time, son." He sent a thumbs up. I put the phone down, and then I made 3 phone calls. Not to Owen, not to Roger, not to anyone at that dinner table. I called 3 people on Northline's senior management team, men and women who had known me through various intermediaries for years. People who understood exactly what it meant when a call came in from a number associated with my operations office. I said, "Run a full operational audit, scope, executive level, timeline immediate, report directly to me." I hung up. I went to the backyard and stood in the cold looking at the maple, which in February is just a shape, a fact of the yard. I thought about what I suspected. I hoped I was wrong. I have always preferred to be wrong about things like this. I was not wrong. The audit took 9 days to complete. When the final report came to me, I sat with it for a long time at the kitchen table with the light on over the sink and the house quiet around me. Not because I was surprised. Because before you do something that cannot be undone, you owe it to everyone involved, including yourself, to be completely certain. Owen had been, for the past 7 months, using Northline's operational infrastructure to develop a competing cold chain logistics venture of his own. Not a rough idea, a structured plan. He had used company time to conduct market research. He had used Northline's internal client lists to map potential customers for the new entity. He had, through a numbered company registered in Ontario in August of the previous year, entered into preliminary discussions with 2 investors while expensing the associated dinners to Northline. He had recruited a Northline dispatch operations manager into the planning process. Every single piece of it was documented in the audit. Clean, time-stamped, thorough. I sat with the file for a while. I thought about Owen at 8 years old pressing his thumb into the back of his hand at the dinner table. I thought about Diane, who would have known exactly what to say and when to say it. Then I went to my bedroom. I opened the closet. I put on the charcoal wool suit I had worn to close the Calgary deal. I had not worn it since. I looked at myself in the hallway mirror for a moment. Then I drove to Burlington. Northline Distribution's head office was in a business park off the QEW, the kind of building that's professional without being beautiful, functional without being memorable. I parked in the reserved space near the entrance. The placard read, Beaumont Cold Store Holdings, reserved. Owen walked past that placard twice a week. He had never asked whose name was attached to it. I took the elevator to the 4th floor. The boardroom was already occupied when I arrived. Northline's senior board members on one side, my outside legal counsel and 2 of my operations VPs on the other. I sat at the head of the table. The audit file was closed in front of me. Owen was called in at 10 o'clock for what he'd been told was a quarterly operational review. He came in the way he always comes into a room he considers his easy, prepared, carrying his usual competence like something he's worn long enough not to notice. He scanned the boardroom, the board members, my lawyers, the documents, and then his eyes found me sitting at the head of the table in the charcoal suit he had never seen, in the room he considered his own. I watched the understanding come. It didn't arrive all at once. It moved through him like something working upward from the floor. The executive search, the offer, the signed contract, the reserved parking space, the proposal at the dinner table, Roger's confident smile as he slid the folder across. Every piece arriving at once and assembling itself in real time into something he had not previously been able to see. He stood in the doorway for a full 10 seconds. I let every one of them be what they were. Then I said, "Sit down, Owen." He sat. I said, "I'm going to say this once, and I'm going to say it as plainly as I can, because this is not about drama. This is about clarity." He was very still. Northline Distribution is a subsidiary of Beaumont Cold Store Solutions. Beaumont Cold Store Solutions belongs to me, has belonged to me for 31 years. The company you have been directing, the salary you have received, the platform you have used to build your professional reputation, they exist because I built them. I brought you in because you were genuinely qualified and because you're my son and I believed in what you could do. What this audit documents is that for the past 7 months you have used Northline's resources, its time, its client data, its operational infrastructure, to develop a direct competitor. I opened the file. The non-compete and fiduciary duty provision in your employment contract, Section 11, Paragraph 4, covers every finding in this report. My legal team is fully prepared to act on that. Owen looked at the board. He looked at my lawyers. He looked back at me. I said, "I'm not interested in destroying you. I am interested in the truth being clear between us, finally without anything else in the way. So here is the choice. You resign today, professionally effective immediately. Your record at Northline stays clean. This stays inside this room. Or we proceed, and everything in this file becomes part of a public legal process." He was quiet for a long moment. What I saw in Owen's face was not what I had expected. Not defiance, not strategy. Something quieter and harder than either of those. I saw a man looking at himself without the buffer of a story he'd been telling about himself, maybe for years. I saw a man who recognized somewhere underneath the shock that he had known this moment was coming because on some level he had always known who he was choosing to become. He said quietly, "I'll resign." Just those 2 words. The cost of them was visible. I said, "Good." I stood. I buttoned my jacket. I picked up the file. At the doorway I stopped. I turned around. One more thing. The proposal your father-in-law brought to the dinner table. The collateral arrangement using my estate. I let a beat pass. My estate attorney filed the restructuring documents 2 weeks ago. Owen's inheritance has been placed in an irrevocable family trust, fully protected, requiring a trustee's signature and mine to access, modify, or collateralize. It cannot be pledged against anything by anyone. Roger's proposal is now a document about money that no longer exists in the form he believed it did. I paused. Please let Sylvia's parents know I was glad to finally meet them, and the lemon tart really was excellent. I drove home. The QEW in the early afternoon is almost peaceful. The city spread out below the escarpment to the left, the lake to the right, the gray water of Lake Ontario catching the flat winter light. The Caravan's heater, which had been having opinions all morning, settled into a reliable warmth somewhere past Burlington. I pulled into my driveway in Hamilton just before 4 o'clock. I sat in the van for a few minutes. 31 years of being a man nobody noticed in a room. 31 years of knowing exactly who I was the entire time. I patted the dashboard. I went inside. I called Owen an hour later, not to say anything about what had happened, just to say I wanted him to come for dinner that weekend if he was up to it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said yes. He came on Saturday. He let himself in through the side door the way he has since he was a teenager. He found me in the kitchen. I had the kettle on. There was bread on the counter that I'd baked that morning because Diane's recipe is not complicated but it requires attention. And sometimes I need something to be not complicated but requiring of attention. We sat at the kitchen table. I poured the tea. Owen wrapped both hands around the mug the way he did when he was small. And I told him everything. The company, the structure, the Northline acquisition, the contract clause, the trust. All of it laid out between us on the table that Diane and I had bought at an estate sale in Dundas in 1994 and had never felt the need to replace. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he asked me, "Dad, why didn't you ever say anything about the company, about any of it?" I looked out the window at the maple. The February light was already going at 4 in the afternoon the way it does in Ontario when winter is thinking about letting go but hasn't decided yet. I said, "Because I wanted you to build your own life, not to inherit a shape that I'd already cut out. I wanted you to look at me and see your father, not a company, not a strategy, just your father." He didn't say anything for a while. His thumb was pressing against the back of his hand. Then he said, "I'm sorry, Dad." And I could hear the difference between an apology that is trying to close a door and an apology that is opening one. I said, "I know, son." We sat there for a while longer. The bread was good. The tea cooled down the way it does when you're not paying attention to it, but you're paying attention to something more important. Outside, the maple stood in the dark yard the way it has for 34 years, and the streetlights came on one by one along the road. And the neighborhood settled into the particular quiet of a Canadian winter evening, which is a quiet that has some weight to it, some substance, like the cold has compressed the air into something denser than it is in other seasons. In Canada, we don't make a lot of noise about the quiet people, the ones who build things without announcing them, the ones who drive old vehicles and wear decent boots and show up for their families and their neighbors and their communities without requiring anyone to applaud. This country was built on people like that. It still runs on people like that. The machinists in Hamilton, the farmers in the Peace Country, the warehouse operators and the long-haul drivers and the people who keep things cold so that other people's food arrives safe. Nobody profiles them. Nobody puts them on panels at conferences. But if you remove them, the whole structure falls. If you have someone like that in your life, a parent, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, a neighbor who always seems to know something the rest of you don't, please tell them you see them, not on social media. Pick up the phone, say it out loud. Because people like that don't tell you what they carry, they never will. And one day they won't be there to tell. And if you're watching this as someone who's worried about a family situation like the one I've described, please know that in Canada there are real protections in place. Every province has its own adult protection legislation. The Federal Elder Abuse Initiative, the Public Health Agency of Canada, and your provincial Ministry of the Attorney General all have resources specifically for situations where a family member's financial security may be at risk. And please, if you're a parent, talk to an estate planning lawyer about an inter vivos trust or a formal testamentary structure for your children's inheritance. In Canada, the law gives you real tools. Use them. It is one of the most loving things you can do, not because it assumes the worst of anyone, but because love that is properly structured lasts longer than love that relies only on trust. Now, I'd love to hear from you, so let's make this a conversation. Comment number 1 if you think I did the right thing by waiting, by being patient rather than confronting things as they happened. Comment number 2 if you think Owen deserved a different kind of conversation before it got to the boardroom. Comment number 3 if you've ever been in a situation where someone in your own family underestimated you because of how you looked or how you lived, or where you were the one doing the underestimating, and you only realized it later. And whatever you comment, tell me where you're watching from, the city, the province, the country, and what time it is where you are. I genuinely love knowing that these conversations reach people I'll never meet, from Victoria to St. John's and places much further than that. It makes the kitchen table feel bigger. This is a fictional story written entirely here in Hamilton, inspired by the kinds of family dynamics that are unfortunately not fictional for everyone. The names, the company, every detail, original and mine alone. If this story stayed with you, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next one. Some men don't look like much when they walk into a room. They just turn out to be the reason the room exists.